The sky over Germany burned in shades of metallic gray on that frozen morning of December 20th, 1943. The war had been devouring Europe for 4 years, and each day brought more shattered machines, more dead men, more cities ablaze. High above, where the thin air froze lungs and turned breath into ice crystals, hundreds of American Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers roared in tight formation, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolt fighters that cut through the sky like silver blades. The formation was heading toward Bremen, a German port city housing shipyards vital to the Nazi war effort. It was the 25th mission for 2nd Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old pilot commanding a B-17F christened Ye Old Pub. His blue eyes scanned the infinite horizon through the cockpit's glass panels while his gloved hands gripped the control yoke with controlled firmness. Behind him, 9 men, gunners, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, manned their stations in tense silence, each knowing their chances of returning home decreased with every mission. The radio crackled with terse orders and coordinates. The formation maintained an altitude of 27,000 feet, more than 8,000 meters above the frozen ground. Below, Germany was a mosaic of snow-covered fields, dark forests, and cities scarred by previous bombing raids. The cold was brutal, penetrating, lethal. Inside the unpressurized aircraft with inadequate heating, the men shivered beneath their fur-lined leather jackets, oxygen masks covering half their faces, eyes fixed on the surrounding skies, searching for the death that could come at any second. Charlie Brown was too young to be there, but war didn't choose by age, it chose by courage or lack of choice. He'd grown up on a farm in West Virginia, where the biggest danger was an angry bull or a summer storm. Now he piloted a 30-ton flying fortress over enemy territory, carrying 4,000 pounds of incendiary and explosive bombs that would be dropped on German targets. The difference between heroes and murderers depended only on which side of history you were writing. The mission proceeded within the lethal normalcy that strategic bombing demanded. The B-17s released their deadly loads over Bremen, and explosions illuminated the city like macabre fireworks. Buildings crumbled. Fire spread. Sirens wailed. And then, at the exact moment Ye Old Pub completed its bombing run and began turning toward the return route, hell descended from the heavens. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, agile, deadly German fighters piloted by Luftwaffe veterans who knew every trick, every angle, every split-second advantage, dove onto the American formation. The 20mm and 30mm cannons of the German fighters spat fire in a rhythmic, murderous cadence. Explosive projectiles punched through the aluminum fuselages of the bombers like knives through paper. Engines exploded. Wings disintegrated. Men died inside their stations before they could even scream. Charlie Brown felt Ye Old Pub shake violently when the first burst hit the right wing. Engine number 3 began vomiting black smoke and orange flames. "Engine 3 on fire!" shouted Flight Engineer Andy Stevens through the intercom. Charlie shut down the engine and activated the fire suppression system, but the fire persisted, licking the wing with voracious tongues. A second attack came from the left. Projectiles pierced the fuselage, passed through the empty bomb bay, and exploded in the aircraft's rear. Tail gunner Hugh Eckenrode screamed when metal shrapnel tore through his station. Blood sprayed across the bomber's interior walls. The smell of fuel, smoke, blood, and fear mixed in the thin air. Fighters at 6 o'clock. Fighters at 6. The top turret gunner's voice cut through the chaos. More Messerschmitts dove at them, exploiting the moment of vulnerability. Charlie yanked the yoke to the right, trying to evade, but Ye Old Pub didn't respond as it should. The controls were heavy, sluggish, as if the aircraft itself were dying. And it was. A 20mm projectile pierced through the bomber's glass nose, exploding inches from navigator Al Sadek, who was thrown against the sidewall, unconscious and bleeding. Bombardier Sam Blackford clutched what remained of the structure, eyes wide with terror and adrenaline. The glass panel had shattered, and now wind at -40°F roared into the cockpit with hurricane force, stealing warmth, consciousness, life. Charlie felt the cold bite his exposed skin. His vision began darkening at the edges, hypoxia, oxygen deprivation. He pulled the mask tight against his face, breathing deeply, forcing the thin air into his lungs. He couldn't pass out. Not now. If he passed out, everyone died. "We're leaving this formation," Charlie ordered, pushing the yoke forward. Ye old pub dove, falling from the sky in a controlled descent, fleeing the formation, fleeing the fighters, fleeing the death pursuing them. But in fleeing, they became isolated. And an isolated bomber was a dead bomber. The German fighters showed no mercy. Another FW-190 screamed past, cannons blazing. The bomber's tail section took multiple hits. The vertical stabilizer was shredded. Rudder cables snapped. The aircraft became nearly impossible to control. Every input Charlie made was met with sluggish, unpredictable response. "We're going down." Pinky Luke, the 19-year-old co-pilot, gripped his controls with white knuckles. "Charlie, we need to bail out." "Not yet." Charlie's jaw clenched. "Not yet." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. They were dying. The aircraft was dying. At 15,000 feet, with 3 engines damaged or destroyed, hydraulics failing, half the crew wounded or dead, and German fighters circling like sharks, they had minutes left. Maybe less. Another burst of cannon fire tore through the fuselage. This time it hit the oxygen system. Bottles exploded. Green oxygen lines whipped through the cabin like serpents. The waist gunners scrambled to disconnect them before the entire aircraft became a flying bomb. They dropped through 12,000 feet. 10,000 feet. The air grew thicker but no safer. Below them, German anti-aircraft batteries tracked their descent, waiting for them to come into range. Charlie looked at the instrument panel, a constellation of red warning lights and failed gauges. Fuel leaking. Oil pressure dropping. Hydraulics gone. Electrical system failing. And still they fell, spiraling toward the frozen German countryside where capture or death awaited. A Focke-Wulf lined up for what would clearly be the killing shot. Charlie could see the German pilot clearly now. Leather helmet, goggles, face set in concentration. The nose of the FW-190 lit up as its cannons fired. This was it. This was the end. Charlie closed his eyes for just a moment, thinking of his mother back in West Virginia, wondering if she'd ever know what happened to him. Then the cannons went silent. Charlie's eyes snapped open. The Focke-Wulf had broken off its attack run, peeling away at the last second. Through the shattered nose of Ye Old Pub, Charlie saw why. Another German fighter had appeared, cutting between them and their attacker. But this wasn't another enemy coming to finish them off. This fighter was protecting them? The aircraft was a Messerschmitt Bf-109, painted in the standard gray-green camouflage of the Luftwaffe, with the black cross and swastika clearly visible on its fuselage. It flew alongside them, maybe 50 feet off their right wing, matching their speed, their altitude, their heading. The pilot looked directly at them. "What the hell is he doing?" Pinky stared at the German fighter, his voice a mixture of confusion and terror. Charlie couldn't answer. His mind couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. German fighters didn't escort American bombers. They destroyed them. That was the war. That was the rule that had governed every moment of every mission for the past 6 months. The Bf-109 pilot gestured clearly, pointing downward, making a motion with his hand. "Land." "Surrender." He wanted them to land. Charlie shook his head slowly, deliberately. No. They were going home. Or they were dying trying. The German pilot seemed to understand. He nodded once, then did something that made absolutely no sense. He moved his fighter directly between Ye Old Pub and the Focke-Wulf that was circling back for another attack. The FW-190 pilot, seeing another Luftwaffe fighter in his attack path, broke off, clearly confused. He waggled his wings. a signal asking what was happening. The Bf-109 pilot waved him off, emphatically. He's actually protecting us," Pinky whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind screaming through the shattered cockpit. Behind them, through the intercom, the crew began to stir. Those who were conscious, who weren't bleeding out or trapped in the wreckage of their stations, began to realize what was happening. An enemy pilot, a man who should be killing them, was instead keeping them alive. "Andy, what's our status?" Charlie forced himself to focus on immediate survival rather than the impossible situation unfolding around them. The flight engineer's voice came back, strained but functional. "We're a flying wreck, Charlie. Engine 3 completely dead. Engine 2 losing oil pressure fast. Engine 1 running rough. Engine 4 is the only one giving us full power. Hydraulics are shot. No rudder control. Elevators barely responding. We've got fuel leaking from multiple tanks. The tail section is held together by prayers and rivets. Can we make it to England?" A long pause. "I don't see how." But the German pilot apparently did see how. He stayed with them, flying escort as if ye old pub were his own squadron mate instead of an enemy bomber he should have already destroyed. When other German fighters approached, curious, aggressive, ready to claim a kill, the Bf-109 pilot waved them off. When they flew over German anti-aircraft batteries that should have filled the sky with lethal black clouds of exploding flak, the gunners held their fire. The presence of the Bf-109 protected them. They flew northwest, toward the coast, toward the North Sea, toward home. The journey should have taken 20 minutes. It took 45. Ye old pub could barely stay airborne, struggling through the sky at 8,000 feet, engines sputtering, airframe groaning, men bleeding. Charlie kept stealing glances at the German pilot. He was close enough now that Charlie could see details. A weathered face, maybe 30 years old, with a dark mustache and eyes that held something Charlie recognized. Exhaustion. Sorrow. The look of a man who'd seen too much death and didn't want to see more. The coast appeared ahead, a thin line where land met sea. Freedom was on the other side of that gray water. But engine number 2 was dying. Charlie could hear it in the rough, irregular beat of the cylinders, feel it in the vibration through the controls. They had minutes before it seized completely. "Andy, shut down number 2 before it catches fire." "Roger." The engine coughed and died. Now they flew on 2 engines, barely enough to stay airborne, definitely not enough to cross 150 miles of open ocean. They started losing altitude. 7,500 feet. 7,000. 6,500. The German pilot saw it happening. He pulled even closer, looking directly at Charlie, making eye contact across the 50 feet of sky separating them. His expression was clear even without words. "You're not going to make it." Charlie met his gaze and nodded slowly. "I know." The Bf-109 pilot pointed down again, more gently this time. "Not a demand. An offer. Land now, while you're still over land. Surrender. Live. Your men will survive." Charlie looked back through the cockpit at his crew. Al Sadek was conscious now but badly wounded. Sam Blackford had shrapnel in his leg. Eckie was dead in the tail. The waist gunners were trying to stop each other's bleeding with torn strips of uniform. These men trusted him. Trusted his decisions. Trusted him to get them home. He looked back at the German pilot and shook his head one more time. "We're going home." The German pilot held his gaze for a long moment. Then, impossibly, he smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not mocking. Something else. Respect. Understanding. The recognition of courage even in an enemy. The Bf-109 pilot saluted. A proper military salute, hand to forehead, formal and respectful. Then he pointed forward, toward England, and nodded. "Go. I'll take you as far as I can." They crossed the coastline together. An American bomber that should have been dead 10 times over, and a German fighter that should have killed it. The North Sea stretched below them, gray and cold and merciless. They flew in formation, two enemies sharing the sky in an impossible moment of humanity. At the edge of German-controlled airspace, where the Bf-109 would have to turn back or risk being shot down by Allied fighters, the German pilot pulled alongside one final time. He was close enough now that Charlie could read the kill markings painted on the fighter's fuselage. Small aircraft silhouettes, each representing a bomber or fighter he'd destroyed. There were many. The German pilot raised his hand in farewell. Then he rocked his wings, a universal pilot gesture of acknowledgement and respect, and banked hard to the left, turning back toward Germany. Charlie watched him disappear into the distance, this stranger who'd saved their lives for no reason that made any sense. No reason except the most basic one. He'd looked into that shattered bomber, seen the wounded men inside, and remembered they were human beings. "He's gone," Pinky said quietly. "Yeah." Charlie's voice was hoarse. "He's gone." But they were still alive. Against all odds, against all logic, against everything war had taught them about enemies and killing, they were still alive. Now they just had to stay that way long enough to reach England. The North Sea stretched endlessly beneath them. Gray water merging with gray sky, no horizon visible, just an infinite void of cold that could swallow them whole and leave no trace. Ye Old Pub shuddered with each gust of wind, her damaged airframe protesting every moment of continued flight. Charlie's arms ached from wrestling the controls. 2 hours of constant tension had turned his muscles to stone. "Fuel status," he called to Andy. The engineer checked his gauges, then rechecked them, hoping the numbers would magically improve. They didn't. "We're burning fuel twice as fast as we should." "The leaks." "Charlie, we might not have enough to reach England." "How much do we have?" "Maybe 30 minutes. Maybe less." 30 minutes. They were still 45 minutes from the English coast. The mathematics of death were simple and unforgiving. They would run out of fuel 15 minutes before reaching land. When that happened, the remaining engines would quit, and Ye Old Pub would drop from the sky like a stone into water that was cold enough to kill a man in 5 minutes. "We could try for a ship," Pinky suggested, scanning the ocean below. "If we could ditch near a convoy." "We won't survive a ditching." Charlie's voice was flat, stating facts without emotion. "Not with this damage. The nose is already shattered. When we hit water, it'll flood instantly. The tail section is barely attached. It'll probably tear off on impact. We're too heavy, too broken. We hit that water and we're dead. So what do we do?" Charlie didn't answer because he didn't have an answer. They were trapped in an equation with no solution. Too damaged to fly fast. Too far from land. Too little fuel. Too much ocean. Behind them, through the intercom, they could hear the crew. Quiet conversations. Prayers. One of the waist gunners was singing softly, an old hymn Charlie remembered from church back home. The men knew. They all knew. They'd survived the fighters, survived the flak, survived injuries that should have killed them. But physics didn't care about survival. Physics just was. Engine number 4 coughed. The sound was slight, barely noticeable, but to a pilot's ears it was as loud as a gunshot. Charlie's eyes snapped to the engine instruments. Fuel pressure on number 4 was dropping. Not failing yet, but falling. One of the fuel lines must have been hit. The leak was getting worse. "Andy, can you transfer fuel from the damaged tanks?" "Already did. We're running on fumes, Charlie. We don't have enough to reach land." Charlie stared ahead at the empty horizon. Somewhere beyond that gray nothingness was England. Home. Safety. Life. But it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did them. He thought about the German pilot. That stranger who'd broken every rule to save them. Had they survived his mercy only to die anyway? Was that the universe's joke, a brief reprieve before the inevitable end? Altitude? Charlie asked. 5,000 feet. They'd been losing altitude slowly for the past 20 minutes, trading height for distance, gliding as much as flying. When they reached 1,000 feet, the minimum safe altitude over water, they'd have to make a decision. Ditch and die quickly, or keep flying until the engines quit and die even more quickly in an uncontrolled crash. Engine 4 coughed again. This time it didn't recover smoothly. The propeller stuttered, the engine shuddered, then resumed running rough. Fuel starvation. They had minutes now, not 30. "Everyone, listen up," Charlie said into the intercom, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "We're not going to make land. We're going to ditch in the North Sea. I need everyone to prepare. Life vests on. Disconnect oxygen. Secure everything loose. Get the wounded to crash positions. When we hit, get out fast. The aircraft will sink in 2 minutes, maybe less. Stay together in the water. The cold will kill you quick if you separate." Silence on the intercom. Then, one by one, acknowledgments. "Come." Professional. These men were terrified, but they were professionals. They'd do their jobs to the very end. "Al, are you conscious enough to navigate?" Charlie asked the wounded navigator. "Yeah, Charlie. I'm here." His voice was weak but clear. "Give me a heading to the nearest ship lane. If we're going in the water, I want to be where someone might find us. Coming up, turn right to heading 285. That'll take us toward the main convoy routes. Maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe." That was all they had left. Maybe. Charlie turned onto the new heading. Engine 1 was running rough now too. They were running out of everything: fuel, altitude, options, time. 4,000 feet. Engine 4 coughed again, ran rough for 5 seconds, then quit completely. The propeller windmilled freely in the slipstream, creating drag, pulling them sideways. Charlie fought the controls, compensating for the asymmetric thrust. 3,000 feet. They were gliding now, one engine barely running, falling from the sky in slow motion toward the gray water below. Charlie could see the waves now, whitecaps driven by a north wind, each one a small mountain of freezing death. 2,000 feet. Pinky pulled out the emergency checklist, reading off the ditching procedure they'd memorized but never practiced. Because no one practiced ditching. You either survived it or you didn't, and the B-17 manual admitted frankly that the odds weren't good. Gear up, confirmed. Flaps, holding at approach setting. Engines, shutting down. Pinky's hands moved across the controls, preparing for impact. Crew, brace for ditching. 1,000 feet. The waves were clearly visible now. Big. Too big. The wind was stronger than Charlie had thought. This wasn't going to be a textbook ditching. This was going to be a controlled crash into a freezing ocean, and their survival would be measured in minutes. 500 feet. Charlie could see individual waves now. He picked his target, a relatively smooth patch between the larger swells. He'd try to land parallel to the waves, let the bomber skip like a stone. If the nose dug in, they'd cartwheel and break apart. If the tail hit first, they'd crack in half. He had one chance to get this exactly right. 300 feet. His hands were steady on the controls. Everything narrowed to this moment. This single action. 45,000 hours of training, hundreds of missions, every hour of flight time in his life. It all came down to the next 30 seconds. 200 feet. Engine 1 quit. Just stopped. No fuel left. They were gliding now, a 30-ton metal glider falling toward water that would shatter them like glass. 100 feet. The waves rushed up. Charlie pulled back on the yoke, flaring the nose up, trying to bleed off speed, trying to touch down as softly as physically possible. 50 feet. The tail struck first. A massive jolt traveled through the entire airframe. Then the belly hit. Metal screamed. Water exploded up and over the shattered nose, flooding the cockpit instantly. The aircraft lurched sideways. The left wing dipped, caught a wave, and started to pull them into a spin. Charlie fought the controls, but there were no controls anymore, just wreckage. They hit again. Harder. The fuselage buckled amidships. The tail section tore away. Water poured in through every hole, every crack, every shattered window. And then, impossibly, they stopped moving. They were floating. Barely. Sinking, but floating. Out. Everyone out. Charlie screamed, already unstrapping his harness. Pinky was ahead of him, kicking out the cockpit window that wasn't already broken, pulling himself through into the freezing water. Charlie followed, plunging into water so cold it felt like knives stabbing every inch of his body. The shock stole his breath. His brain screamed at him to inhale, but he forced himself not to. One breath of seawater and he'd drown in seconds. He surfaced, gasping, and looked back at ye old pub. She was sinking fast, nose already underwater, tail gone, the remains of her wings tilted at crazy angles. Men were climbing out, splashing into the water, shouting to each other. "Stay together!" Charlie yelled through chattering teeth. "Everyone together!" They clung to each other in a circle, 9 men, 8 alive, 1 dead, bobbing in the gray water as their aircraft sank beneath the waves. Ye old pub disappeared in less than 90 seconds, taking their hopes of rescue with her. The cold was already working into their bones. 5 minutes, Charlie remembered. That's how long a man lasted in winter North Sea water. 5 minutes before hypothermia shut down your brain and you slipped beneath the waves. Then Pinky pointed, his arm shaking from cold. "Ship. There's a ship." On the horizon, barely visible through the gray mist, a dark shape. A British destroyer, racing toward them, having seen them ditch. The crew had seen them. Help was coming. They just had to survive long enough to reach it. The destroyer's crew pulled them from the water one by one, hauling frozen, barely conscious men up the cargo net like sacks of grain. Charlie came aboard last, making sure every member of his crew was safe before allowing himself to be rescued. His hands were so numb he couldn't grip the net. 2 British sailors had to climb down and physically carry him up. They laid the survivors on the destroyer's deck, wrapped them in wool blankets, poured hot tea into them, and took them below where the ship's doctor worked frantically to save men who'd been minutes from death. Charlie sat in the corner of the medical bay, shivering uncontrollably despite the blankets, watching the doctor work on Al Sadek's shrapnel wounds and Sam Blackford's leg. 8 men alive. 1 dead. Eki would never see home again, never tell his family about the mission, never grow old. He'd died at 22, in the tail of a bomber over Germany, killed by a man he'd never met and would never meet. "You're lucky," the British doctor said, not looking up from his work. 5 more minutes in that water and you'd all be dead. That destroyer was headed back from convoy escort. Pure chance they were in position to see you ditch. Luck. Was that what it was? Or was it something else? Charlie's mind drifted back to the German pilot. That Bf-109 that had stayed with them, protected them, escorted them to the coast. Without him, they'd have been shot down over Germany. They'd have never reached the water. They'd have been 10 men dead instead of 1. "Sir." One of the British sailors approached Charlie hesitantly. "We radioed your status to command. They're sending transport to take you back to your base once we reach port." "Thank you." Charlie's voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what happened up there? The radio reports said you were missing over Germany, presumed lost. How did you make it all the way to the coast with that much damage?" "How did they?" Charlie tried to find words to explain the impossible, to describe a German pilot who'd saved his enemies because, why? Why had he done it? What possible reason could a Luftwaffe fighter pilot have to protect an American bomber? "I don't know," Charlie finally answered. "I honestly don't know." 3 days later, Charlie stood in the debriefing room at his home base in England. The intelligence officers had grilled him for hours, wanting every detail of the mission, the attack, the damage, the ditching. But when Charlie mentioned the German pilot who'd protected them, who'd flown escort, who'd saved their lives, the officers exchanged glances. "Lieutenant Brown," the senior intelligence officer said carefully, "you were under extreme stress. Wounded crew, damaged aircraft, oxygen deprivation. Are you certain about what you saw?" "I know what I saw, sir." Charlie's voice was firm. "A German Bf-109 protected us, flew with us for nearly 30 minutes, waved off other fighters. That's why we're alive." The officer made notes but clearly didn't believe him. Why would he? It made no sense. It violated everything they knew about aerial combat, about the war, about the Germans. "Lieutenant, I'm going to ask you not to discuss this aspect of your mission with anyone. The men need to believe the enemy is the enemy. Stories about German mercy, they complicate things." Charlie nodded slowly. He understood. The war needed to be simple. Us versus them. Good versus evil. No room for nuance, for moments of humanity, for German pilots who remembered that the men in the bombers were human beings just like them. But Charlie would never forget. He knew what he'd seen. He knew what that German pilot had done. 47 years later, in 1990, Charlie Brown, now a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel living in Seattle, sat at his kitchen table reading aviation magazines. He'd never stopped thinking about that December day in 1943. Never stopped wondering about the German pilot. Who was he? Did he survive the war? Did he ever think about the American bomber he'd saved? On an impulse that he couldn't quite explain, Charlie wrote a letter to a German Fighter Pilot Veterans Association describing the incident, asking if anyone knew about a Bf-109 pilot who'd flown such a mission. 6 months later, he received a reply. The letter was in halting English, translated from German. It was from a man named Franz Stigler, living in Vancouver, Canada. He'd been a Luftwaffe fighter pilot during the war. He'd flown Bf-109s. And on December 20th, 1943, he'd encountered a badly damaged B-17 over Germany. Charlie's hands shook as he read. Stigler's letter explained everything. He'd been returning from combat, low on ammunition, when he'd spotted ye old pub limping toward the coast. He'd pulled alongside, seen the shattered nose, the wounded men, the desperate situation. And he'd remembered something his commanding officer had told him years before. "If I ever see you shooting at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." A man in a parachute is helpless. Honor matters, even in war. To Stigler, the men in that crippled bomber were helpless. No different than men in parachutes. So he'd protected them. Against orders. Against doctrine. Against everything he'd been trained to do. Because it was the right thing to do. He'd expected to be court-martialed when he returned and reported what he'd done. But he'd never reported it. He'd kept it secret for 47 years, believing he'd violated his duty, saved enemies who would go on to bomb more German cities. But he'd also saved 10 men who wanted to live, who had families waiting for them, who were doing their duty just as he was doing his. Charlie picked up the phone with trembling hands and dialed the number written at the bottom of the letter. A voice answered in accented English. "Hello. Is this Franz Stigler?" "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Charlie Brown. I was the pilot of the B-17 you escorted to the coast in December 1943. Silence on the other end. A long, heavy silence. Then, quietly, "You made it. I've wondered for 47 years if you made it. We made it because of you." They talked for 3 hours that day. Two old men who'd once been enemies, who'd shared the sky in an impossible moment of humanity.